actually. Today we will be talking about the growth, and as you know, we are in the remote acceleration program of Startup Istanbul, and the growth and grow faster is really important for all of the startups. It's a problem for all of them, and today we will get insights from Dave about this subject. And so, Dave, stage is yours.
All right.
Okay.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me. Thank you all for coming to spend some time with me as part of your day or your evening, wherever you are in the world. I am based in New York, just north of the city, in my garage. It's really, really hot. And I've got a presentation on the science of growth here for you. So before we dig into it, just a little about me. My name is Dave Zohrob. I've been working in startups for about 15 years here in the US. I'm currently the co-founder and CEO of my third startup, which is called Chartable. It is a podcast analytics and attribution company. So we help folks who create podcasts, market and grow their shows. And we help folks who advertise on podcasts figure out if their ads are working. For those who don't know, podcasts are been around for a really long time. It's basically like radio on demand on your phone or on your computer or on your smart speaker. It's a huge market that's been really underserved and undermonetized, both in the US and around the world. Before Chartable, I've started a couple other companies, and I spent a long time, the biggest chunk of my 15 years in startups at AngelList, which is a network for startups to raise capital and for folks to for startups to recruit team members. And my biggest role at AngelList was on growth. So one of my top line metrics every week was how many new users do we have, how many folks are looking for jobs, how many folks are hiring. Before that, I worked at a startup called hotornot.com, which is a really early dating site, kind of the inspiration for something like Tinder, and incidentally, Facebook as well. And then before that, I was at Microsoft, which really had nothing to do with growth. I was working on Outlook and fixing bugs in various components of Outlook. But I love working on growth. As I said, it's a problem that every startup faces, whether you're brand new or you've been around for a really long time. The approach that I like to take is what I call the science of growth, which is maybe a little bit of a fancy way of saying that there's a systematic way to tackle the problem of growing. And so if there's like kind of one unifying message of what I'm trying to say here, it's that growth is a science, not an art. I think a lot of the time when we think about growth, and maybe it's like a little less, depending on which blogs or hacker news posts you've been reading, maybe a little less prevalent of a worldview these days, that there's some kind of magic growth dust that you can sprinkle on your product, like whether that's email loop or some kind of referral system, and all of a sudden you're going to be growing and everything's going to be fine. That rarely, if ever, actually happens. And so what the only way that I've found to be able to do it, that I think that is a repeatable approach, is to think of your growth as something scientific, like a process that you can work on that will over time deliver you great growth results, not like some kind of magic thing you can stick into your product. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. The Prezzo is split into 3 different parts. The first part is about kind of preparing for growth and making sure that you're ready to kind of undertake this kind of scientific approach. And then it's about setting metrics so that you can actually judge whether or not what you're doing is working. And then finally, the actual kind of nitty gritty of what I call the growth loop, which is the 4 steps you can run every week or every other week to start to get results from your growth program. So the first step is about getting ready. It's about preparing your team for growth. And before we even get too deep into what that means, I think the first thing to think about is whether or not your product has what's called product market fit. And for those who don't know, product market fit is when you're building something. I mean, one of the biggest killers of startups, if you listen to Paul Graham or any of the YC folks, so we end up building something that people don't want. And product market fit is some kind of early indication that you are building something that people want. Mark Andreessen, the founder of Andreessen Horowitz and the founder of Netscape, has literally gone as far as to say is that the only thing that matters is getting a product market fit for an early stage startup. And what does that feel like? Well, when you've got product market fit, the the product is working. It's not like there's necessarily one metric or one kind of indicator that you're there. But when you've got product market fit, people who sign up use the product. They tend to actually complete the different steps of your funnel. They tend to email you support questions and ask you for features that you haven't yet implemented. Use the product frequently. All the kind of signs of a healthy product. That's where product market fit is. It's not necessarily just one thing or another thing, but this kind of healthy interplay between all the different parts of your product. So knowing, basically, it's a sign that what you're building is actually connecting with your target users. So when you have product market fit, it feels really good. You've got your guitar up in the corner and racing to the sunset. When you don't have product market fit, it feels a little bit more like this. Maybe you get some users to sign up, but they're not sticking around. Or maybe they do sign up and they stick around for a little bit and then they stop using it. They don't tell their friends. It's just not quite working. And so before you apply anything else I talk about in this presentation, stop. If you don't have product market fit, you got to work on that first. No amount of experimentation or working on your sign-up funnel or email campaigns are going to fix a fundamental flaw with your product. So the first thing to do is to get to product market fit. And if you're not there yet, hopefully some of the stuff I'm going to talk about today will be helpful. But in the future, but it's much more important for you to focus on your core product right now. So make sure that you got product market fit. And then once you've got that, I would recommend spending a little time thinking about what's known as your magic moment. Your magic moment is some point in your product funnel or the kind of life cycle of a user using your product where things are actually really clicking for them. Stuart Butterfield, the CEO of Slack, which has just seen unbelievable growth over the last 10 years or 5 years rather, they define their magic moment as once somebody sends 2,000 messages, 93% of those customers are still using Slack today, right? That's just an unbelievable retention rate for a product. There's a lot of other kind of startup mythology around magic moments. For example, Facebook found that once you had 7 friends using Facebook, that you would stick around. So they spent all their growth loops or all their growth efforts trying to get folks to get 7 friends. There's different versions of this for every company. It's going to be different whether if you're B2C versus B2B, if you're e-commerce versus some kind of app. But pretty much every product has a magic moment where somebody really unlocks the key value offering that you're putting out there, and they see that value, and that means that they're going to stick around. Once you've got product market fit and you've got your magic moment, the next step is to do what I call instrumenting your product, and that's basically just making sure you're set up to track the key kind of interactions that users have with your product. There's a zillion different ways to do this. I wouldn't overthink it. These are just a handful of products that I've used in the past, like Segment, Mixpanel, Amplitude, Heap. Everybody uses Google Analytics, one form or another. All you really need to do is make sure that you've got some way of telling whether or not people are doing the things that you want them to do in your app or your website. It doesn't need to be the fanciest system. You don't need to build it yourself. You don't need to spend a lot of money on it if you don't want to. For example, we at Chartable, we use Amplitude and Google Analytics. Amplitude has an extremely generous free plan up to 10 million events a month, which for any even quasi B2B software is more than enough to get really far. We also use Google Analytics for kind of basic marketing stuff, SEO and kind of email campaigns and stuff like that. So don't overthink it. Put something in there, but you need to have your instrumentation done before you start experimenting, hopefully for obvious reasons. You can't grow what you can't measure. And finally, the last step of getting ready is being prepared to fail. I don't want to be too much of a downer here, but I think that again, if you've been influenced by some of these kind of magical thinking, growth blog posts or hacks or whatever, that you think that once you sparkle the growth dust, that everything is going to be okay. But really, most growth experiments fail, just like most startups end up failing in one way or another. And as James Clear put it, your failures are simply data points that can help lead you to the right answer. Failure is the cost you pay to be right. So when you run a growth experiment and it fails, that's okay. You learn something, right? And so for me, it took a little while to kind of internalize that that failure is actually positive, that it's actually progress rather than going backwards. And I think for a lot of folks, it is difficult, even though there are so many cliches around, you can't, you haven't failed if you haven't tried, all that stuff. It's actually really hard on a day-to-day basis to know that a good chunk of the work that you do and a good chunk of the code that you write, good chunk of the marketing that you do is not going to work. But that's the reality of doing this kind of growth work. So the three things that I look for when I'm hiring people for this sort of role, the three things I try to tell my own teammates and myself when doing this kind of work is that you have to be creative because again, there's no magic dust to sprinkle. So you have to come up with new and innovative ways of growing your product. You have to be relentless because it's not going to happen. Growth is not going to magically happen the first time you turn on something like an email loop. And you also have to be resilient, again, because most of these things fail. And those are the three kind of characteristics that I look for, again, in hiring someone for this role or just preparing yourself for this role to know that these are the things that are going to be tested when you're doing growth for your startup. So let's move on to phase two. After getting ready for growth, you have to actually set your metrics, set some quantifiable growth goals that you're going to work on during your process. The most common way that I've seen to do this, and especially if you're new to this sort of thing, the simplest way to start getting growth going is to just pick one metric that matters. It's also known as kind of the North Star metric or true north for your startup. Rather than having like a bunch of different things that you're working on, you just pick one thing and like make sure everybody on your team knows what that number is, and that whether it's at your weekly all hands or in a Slack update or something else that you do with your team every week, that everybody on your team knows what that metric is and knows whether or not you're achieving it. As Conrad Wadowski, who's worked at Teachable and has done a bunch of other growth stuff, he says, like, once you prioritize one growth metric, every decision becomes faster and more effective. And I've found that to be true across every company, every app I've ever worked at or worked on. So there's a bunch of different metrics that could be your key metric. For example, here's just some of the most common ones. You have active users, the number of folks who are actually using your app every week. Churn, so if you have a small number of users, this could be really important. How often do people stick around? Revenue, you can't really argue with revenue. It's kind of an amazing metric when it comes down to it, if your app is the kind of app that somebody pays for. The customer acquisition cost for a lot of D2C or subscription or commerce companies. One of the key, most important metrics is like how much it costs to acquire a new customer. The flip side of customer acquisition cost is lifetime value, or LTV. That's how much money you derive from a customer over their interaction with you. And then finally, one of the ones that we like to use as a qualitative measure that somehow translates into something quantitative is Net Promoter Score, or NPS. Any one of these could be the metric for your startup. Maybe none of them is. You might have to think a little bit harder about what actually matters to you. At Chartable, the biggest one that we actually track right now, because we've kind of moved away from, we're kind of not in our earliest stage anymore. We're a somewhat established company. We've raised money. We have paying customers. We're mostly focused on revenue growth right now. That's our number one thing. Everybody at the company knows how we're doing on revenue, both on the sales team, the marketing, and engineering teams, product teams. We also use a metric that is very specific to us. A lot of our product value is derived from us performing podcast analytics on downloads that come in. And so we use our total number of tracked downloads as kind of a top line metric of how many publishers are we serving, how much value are we actually delivering to the podcast ecosystem. And then finally, we use Net Promoter Score also as a, I'll get to this concept in a moment, but the thing I like about NPS is that it does balance kind of the customer feedback with these kind of more hard metrics like revenue and downloads. And again, we review these numbers every single week. Hopefully, I don't know if you want to test me on this. Hopefully, if you asked any of my teammates how we're doing, they'd know exactly what these numbers are doing, what they're trending like. And I think that's really important to keep everybody focused, even if they're not directly working on growth at your company. These are the things that are our North Stars. And if there was really only one metric I had to choose, I would choose revenue right now. We're focusing on scaling our sales and marketing pipelines. So when you're setting metrics, there's a whole set of metrics that I think are really dangerous. This is like when you hear folks say that being too quantitative can be misleading. I think this is maybe some chunk of what they're talking about. I want you to, if I can employ you to do anything, is to avoid vanity metrics. Vanity metrics are things like registered users or your app downloads or page views. Ultimately, these are things, especially with stuff like registered users, there's no way for your registered user number to ever go down, right? So it's always going to be going up, and that can lead to a misleading sense of progress. And the same thing with stuff like downloads and page views. Maybe they're not going to go down, but they don't necessarily indicate that somebody has gotten value from your product. They haven't reached their magic moment. They haven't unlocked what it is you're trying to do for them. And so they can, having your download numbers go up, but not have anyone actually activate and use your product is a bad thing. And so focusing on the metrics that actually matter, like active users, engagement, customer acquisition costs, revenue, profit, those are the things that are going to be much better North Stars than anything that goes up and to the right just by nature, like cumulative users. Another thing I'd like to encourage you to do is to think about countermetrics. So this is a concept that I haven't really seen out there much other than in my own work. So hopefully I'm not the crazy dude who thinks this is important, the only one. But basically, the idea of a countermetric is to help prevent blinding focus on a single goal. So if your number one goal, your North Star metric, was revenue, your revenue could trend upwards even if there are some problems bubbling underneath the surface. And so that might not be reflected in that revenue goal for a while, whether that's because you have recurring revenue and folks haven't canceled yet, or if there's just kind of a lingering customer dissatisfaction that's growing. I like to, whenever we set a big top line metric, also set another metric that says, hey, what would tell us that there's some bad news on the horizon, even if it's not reflected in our top line metric yet? And so Net Promoter Score is a really good example of a counter metric. It's the same question no matter what. How likely are you to recommend our product or service to a friend? And for us, it keeps us in check to make sure that we're still, that our customers are happy and that there's not like major changes in satisfaction or dissatisfaction that are not reflected in our top line metrics. Another thing to note is that your metrics might change over time. So when you're just getting started and you've just kind of cracked product market fit, you might not be focused on revenue, you might be focused on new user activations. And as your company matures, that's going to change. And whether that your focus shifts to revenue, or if you're focusing on retaining existing users because you've already saturated the new users. When you set a North Star metric, it doesn't need to be your metric for life. It can change, and that's okay. For example, at Chartable, we didn't focus on revenue until actually relatively recently. So the company's a little over 2 years old. And we'd only really kind of cracked the sales model earlier this year. And so that's when revenue became a big focus for us, because it really is directly linked to our customers' activation and engagement with our product. We used to focus a lot more on active users. That has kind of fallen by the wayside because a lot of our users don't pay us. And that just isn't that helpful as a tiny startup. So we're not like a mainstream consumer product where like having a huge base of free users is super important to us. So for us, it has changed quite a bit. And the focus on revenue has been super clarifying, I think, for everyone at the company. Okay, so now that we've gotten ready by preparing ourselves to fail and set up our metrics and made sure our product is totally instrumented, we've come to actually the meat of this presentation, which is what I call the growth loop. And this is basically a 4-step process that you can run, whether it's on a weekly cadence or a monthly cadence, whatever frequency you're able to do it, where you're able to break growth into 4 discrete steps and execute them over and over again and hopefully get good results out of it. And so those 4 steps are brainstorming, prioritizing, executing, and then finally debriefing, or kind of learning from what you've done. And we're going to dive into each of them one at a time, starting with brainstorming. So the goal of the brainstorming step is to generate as many ideas as possible for growth experiments, right? What are the different ways that you could grow? And there's no bad ideas here. And this is one place where, I have a background as an engineer and I still write code for better or for worse a lot of the time. where actually knowing how hard something is probably a detriment to generating good ideas. The goal here is to think about what could grow your company, not about how much work it's going to be. And also to allow for bad ideas, quote unquote bad ideas or crazy ideas, to have some place for discussion. Because a lot of times those bad ideas end up being good, or there's some kernel of goodness underneath the surface. So during this stage, one framework I find helpful is what's called the traction framework. There's a book called Traction by Gabe Weinberg, who's the founder of a search engine called DuckDuckGo. It's a great book, super helpful. In the book, he outlines that there's at least 19 different traction channels. I'm not going to read them all to you, but there's a bunch of them. And when I first read that list, I thought, man, there's no way that all of these can apply to my startup. But I really encourage you when you're in your brainstorming sessions to really think about each one of these and whether or not it could apply to you. For example, at Chartable, we are currently doing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 of these traction channels. Some of them will work better than others, but I wouldn't have necessarily guessed that we'd be doing 9 of the 19 this early into our company's life. The ones that have been most effective for us have been piggybacking on existing platforms. So it turns out that podcasts are RSS feeds that have to have an email address in them because that's what Apple requires to be listed in the Apple podcast directory. And it turns out if you write people emails to those addresses, that they'll write back. And so if you're offering a valuable service to those podcasters, maybe they'll come and try it out. We've also had some success with trade shows. We've done in-person events. We've done a fair amount of content marketing, writing on our blog, also trying to get kind of regular press from The Verge, TechCrunch, et cetera. All these things are worth examining. Maybe they're a fit for your startup, maybe they're not, but I wouldn't dismiss any of them out of hand. So there's 19 different channels. And when you're doing your brainstorming session, it's worth thinking about every single one. The next thing that I like to do, and it's something that I've actually been leaning into more as I've gotten a little bit older and a little bit grayer, is writing things down. So writing down what I call an experiment brief, which is like language borrowed from actual science, but this is the science of growth here. So just like writing what you're trying to achieve, what the name of the experiment is, give it something kind of so you can identify it, some kind of hypothesis for why you think it's actually going to help your company, and then defining like the metrics of success and countermetrics so that you know how whether or not it's achieved your goal. This is something that we do basically for every project at Chartable, and I have an example or two here shortly, which I'll show you. So once you've written up all these experiments and you've brainstormed them, the next step is to prioritize them. And I have a very simple scoring framework that I borrowed from Sean Ellis, who wrote this book on growth hacking, which is called ICE. And so for every project, every experiment, you give it a score between 1 to 5 on impact, how much impact it's going to have for your company. How awesome would it be if this thing actually worked? That's impact. Confidence is how confident you are that the thing is going to achieve its impact. And then finally, how easy it is. And these three things together, I just give it a score of 1 to 5, and I'll show you a sample from a real spreadsheet we actually use. These three things together can give you a really easy way to prioritize what would otherwise be potentially an unwieldy set of experiments. So what we do is we put it in a spreadsheet. Maybe you can put it up on the wall and Post-it notes. It's really whatever works for you. We have a Google Doc that we go over once a week, and we score every project that we're thinking about. We actually use this not just for growth, but also for our product in general. So these are actually the 5 things that are actually in our prioritization doc at Chartable right now. There's just different projects, and then we've scored them 1 to 5 on impact, confidence, and ease, and then you just add them up. And the ones that have the highest scores are, you don't necessarily need to work down the list in order necessarily, but it does, our document, our spreadsheet probably has like 50 different projects in it, and it really does help you wade through. There's so many different competing ideas, whether it's for growing your product or just for doing your product roadmap in general. We found the ICE framework to be super helpful. And it also, even though it's quantitative, it's just not that heavyweight, right? You can score something 1 to 5 pretty quickly and easily. Okay, so now that we've brainstormed, we prioritized our different experiments. Finally, it's time to actually run them. So this one, I don't actually have a ton of detail here. It really depends on what you're doing. But what we recommend is to make somebody on your marketing team or engineering team the actual owner of that project, so that their job is to make sure that the experiment is ready to go in terms of the metrics actually being instrumented. So for example, if you're working on your sign-up page, does the sign-up page have everything you need to be actually measured, so you can see what you're doing is working? And then that owner is in charge of actually starting and stopping the experiment. And so they're the ones in the lab actually making sure this thing actually happens. And then finally, the last step is what we call debriefing. And this is a step that often gets ignored when you're working in especially a very small startup. A lot of this work around understanding what you achieved and what you learned with your experiment can feel like unnecessary work. You want to get back to just get back to building more experiments and doing more things. But I really encourage us, even if you just try it out for a little bit, to write down your results, whether you actually achieved what you wanted to achieve or you fail, right? And you want to share those results with the team, because that way you can actually learn from your experiments. Whether, okay, you've done 3 or 4 different experiments on the sign-up flow, nothing's worked. There's probably something to be learned there. Either you need a more radical change to your sign-up flow, or maybe you need to be spending some time on something else. And so that's the 4 stages of the growth loop: brainstorming, prioritizing, executing, debriefing. This is literally, this is not just theoretical. This is literally what I do every week. This is how I've structured my week at my company and how I try to run my team. So it's really worked for us at Chartable. It really worked for us at AngelList, and that company's continuing to do well. And hopefully it'll work for you. So as you're doing this, I want to just reiterate the key point for me: failure is okay. You're going to fail, especially when you're putting this growth team together for the first time. If you've never done a structured approach to growth, it's okay to fail. And it's even better to fail when you write it up and you can share it with your team. And hopefully when you're doing this for your own companies, you're able to build a culture where even the folks that do experiments that don't work can be celebrated for trying those things. So to summarize my prezo on the science of growth, I'm getting done a little bit early, which means we'll have more time for questions, hopefully. There's just 3 steps: just getting ready, making sure you have product market fit, finding your magic moment, instrumenting your product, setting your metrics, whether that's one metric that matters or a few of them, as well as setting some counter metrics so you have something to kind of guide against your primary metrics. Then finally, running that growth loop, those 4 steps over and over. Again, growth is a science, not an art. And hopefully with these tools and the others out there, you can be creative, relentless, and resilient to solve that #1 problem that every startup has, which is growing. So I'm happy to take questions now. I think Elif is going to set those up.
Yes. Hi again, Dave.
Hi.
It was a great presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Chris has a question, first of all. Let me just put it on the screen as well for you to see it. Just a second.
Yeah.
Here. It's a bit long question. How do you know when you have reached the peak of growth? How do you even know if you are growing based on the target you set for yourself, which may be market size or against a competitor?
Those are a lot of good questions. I will do my best to attack them one by one. I think the one that stands out to me as kind of the most fundamental is how do you even know if you're growing? And that to me, it's more about an internal metric than looking at your market size or your competition. For us, we're working in a still underdeveloped market in podcasting. And so, we have competitors. There are other folks doing different things in that market. But really, our biggest competition is us. Can we sustainably and repeatedly deliver value to our users and get them to pay us for it? That's our job, right? And so we've decided on our own metrics, and that's why even though we've decided them, revenue is a metric that is pretty hard to argue with. It's something that our investors are happy with when it goes up. It's something that we're happy with when it goes up. So as long as we're continuing to grow our user base and grow revenue, I think we're growing. How do you know when you've reached the peak of growth? I think is also a really good question, and it's a tough question. And that, I think, does get more into questions of market size. Hopefully you're operating in a big market. That's why so many VCs encourage folks to work in large markets, because you don't want to run out of steam and still not be making enough money to justify your next round or your acquisition or your IPO, whatever goal you're working for. And that's actually, pretty on the nose for us in podcasting. The podcast market is still under $1 billion in the US, which by venture, by like a venture growth metric, is really small. And our bet is that the market's going to grow significantly over the next 5 years. And so our goal is to grow along with that. And so hopefully we're not going to have exhausted that growth for a long time. But it is a really good question. And it's kind of hard to say without knowing a little bit more about your particular case, but it's something worth thinking about.
He has another question, but before that, actually, for example, if you grow, if you had one customer this month and next month you have 2 customers, you can say literally that you grow 100%, but it doesn't make much sense.
Yeah.
So, how do you think should the startups evaluate themselves? It's a similar question with Chris.
Yeah, I think it's hard, right? That was absolute, especially when you're starting from zero. It's really easy to say, oh yeah, we've doubled every month. It's like, okay, well, you went from 1 to 2 to 4 customers. Like, that's cool, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean you're on a path to like a sustainable business, right? And so I think there's kind of 2 audiences for these metrics. One of them is like an external audience, like a press or investor or something. And I understand there's a real impulse to make yourself look really good. We all have to do it ultimately if we want to work well with investors and work with the press and like have people believe in us. Startups like are in some sense like convincing people over time and over a number of years that what you're doing is valuable and worthwhile. And so having good metrics helps with that, right? But you're also building. You also have to be honest with yourself about what's actually working, right? And so. I would focus in that case on, if you went from 1 to 2, on the number of new customers rather than the kind of relative jump, because like that way you can say like every month we need to like keep adding people. Once you have like a bigger base, then I think that the relative, like, okay, we need to grow 10% a month or whatever the number is, like that'll be more meaningful. But in those very early stages, yeah, those percentage metrics can be pretty misleading. And if you're misleading on purpose so that you can, get some better press, like I understand that, but don't mislead yourself, right?
Yeah, it's also about the product market fit, right? Mm-hmm. How do you understand when you get the product market fit?
Yeah, it's one of those. It's one of those hard to pin down things. There are folks who have tried to make it much more quantitative. I forget who it was. Somebody has a question, which is basically like you survey your users periodically and say, how disappointed would you be if product X went away, right? And if not a lot of people say like, I would be very disappointed or at least mildly disappointed, then that's a sign that you're not building something that's valuable enough, right? Paul Graham had this thing in one of his essays that said, it's much better to be very, very, very well liked or loved by a small group of people than to be moderately liked by a large group of people. And that's really true with early stage startups. You want to build something that's essential. If it's not essential, it's going to be hard to build a great business out of it. And so that question of how disappointed would you be if product X went away, it's not necessarily like a be all end all. It's not going to save the world or anything, but it could be helpful if you're trying to figure out whether or not you've reached that product market fit.
Okay, next question is. Also, if you cannot grow vertically, can you grow horizontally with new product? Would horizontal growth be a distraction, really?
That's a really good question. And I don't want to use the standard cop-out of it depends, but I think it does depend. I think there's companies that have done really well doing both ways. And it really kind of depends on your market, right? For us, we are actually facing, like, this is literally the strategic question facing our company right now. we've been 2 years going very deep in the audio vertical. And now our question is, do we just keep going in this like very specific, still kind of niche, still kind of a small market? Or do we take some of the technology that we built for podcasts and apply it to something like, for example, smart speakers or something like streaming video or something other than podcasts? I don't know that there's a right answer. There's trade-offs, just like with everything else. So for us, like we're probably going to go vertical because for the reasons that Chris sort of implied, which is that we're worried that going horizontal could be a distraction. We already have a customer base in audio. We have customers who are publishers, customers who are advertisers. It's probably easier to sell them more solutions for problems they have with audio than to like pivot to finding a new customer base or whatever. But it really depends on where you're at. At some point, if we've exhausted everything we can do in podcasting, we'll have to branch out and go horizontal.
Okay. And before moving on, actually, could you please tell us about your startup, also Chartable? What do you do, and what mistakes have you done since the beginning?
Sure. So my co-founder and I worked together at AngelList for a number of years, and we both quit at the end of 2017, so a while ago now. We didn't have any idea of what we wanted to do. We just quit knowing that we wanted to start a company, which is a pretty dangerous, place to be. Basically, we were going to bootstrap. We were not going to raise any money, and we thought, okay, we're going to give ourselves like a year and change to start something. And we started off actually by building something totally different. We built customer service survey software, like basically Net Promoter Score software, and it went very, very poorly. We couldn't sell it. It was just it wasn't working. We did not reach product market fit. Let's put it that way. And so after spending a bunch of time on that, we realized that we didn't have that much time left. And so we thought, okay, let's just hit pause. Let's make a list of the stuff that we think is interesting. And let's try to spend 2 or 3 months working on different ideas. And if it's not working, we'll just throw it away. And so we made a big list, and somehow podcasting ended up at the top of the list. And so we started a podcast, which was summarizing that Y Combinator news board, Hacker News, every day. And pretty much right away, it took off. We were getting thousands of downloads a day right after we started it, which never really happens. I mean, I've been building stuff on the internet for a really long time. It used to be the case that putting stuff out there, like for example, I used to make apps for the App Store back in 2009, which is really early, and pretty much any app you could put in there would get downloads. That's not the case anymore. So we kind of stumbled into this market where I thought, like, if people are listening to me read them the news, basically, then they must really, really want more stuff in their ears that they're not getting. So we spent a few months researching the market and ended up building podcast analytics tools based on, it's actually a real clear pattern match to what we saw in the App Store back in those early days. There were companies like App Annie and Flurry that grew to provide developers with analytics for their apps. And we saw the same kind of challenges with podcasting, which is that nobody really knows how to grow a show. Nobody has these, the data is like pretty poor compared to other digital media. And so we build tools to help close that gap.
Great. And since the first day I think it was a startup targeting the global market. Is that true, or US market?
Yes. So podcasting is worldwide, and there are big pockets all around the world. We have customers in the Middle East, Latin America, Australia, UK. But the most developed advertising market is in the US for podcasting, and so our biggest paying customers are in the US. But we recently did sign two customers in the Middle East, which we're excited about. And I think that there's a huge potential for growth all around the world here.
Okay. There's another question here. Once you set the key metric like revenue, should you also measure the activities that contribute to the key metric?
That is a really good question. So I'm gonna go ahead and guess what you mean here, but like it's not just growth experiments that contribute to revenue, but also like sales, right? And your sales team, your marketing team, a lot of folks have inputs to that revenue output. And so yeah, we try to measure as much as we can. We're nerds, right? We run a data company, so we're pretty into putting numbers on things. But yeah, so we measure the sales funnel. We use a tool called Pipedrive. A lot of folks use Salesforce, Outreach. There's a bunch of different tools for this. But just measuring the number of outbounds, the number of demos that we give every week, and how many of those convert to actual paid contracts. Same thing for our content marketing. We try to put metrics on that. How many new leads did we get from that? Pretty much, I mean, I'm totally biased here because I'm such a data nerd, but like almost everything can be measured. So if it can be measured as an input to that goal, I think it's worth doing. A lot of other people would say, maybe that's not worth it, but I don't think so. I find it helpful. I don't know how to make a decision without data. So.
And Alexandria asked about herself. I am exploring vlogging. Can I podcast my startup?
Yeah, you can. It's a great question. I think podcasts are really underutilized especially for B2B. I don't know what your startup is.
He also added, sorry, I have a professional radio broadcaster. Do it with me, and we usually load on YouTube. What is the company you went for podcasts?
Yeah, so podcasts are a funny thing in that, like YouTube is a centralized platform. Like you upload the video to YouTube, and when somebody wants to watch it, they like go to the YouTube player, right? Podcasts, you can listen on your phone, you can listen in your car, you can listen on a smart speaker. So there's a bunch of different components that are kind of separate in podcast world, which are kind of all integrated in the YouTube world. And so you do need a company that will host your MP3 files. We don't do that, but there's plenty of great ones. The one I'd recommend is called transistor.fm. They're based in the US. There's also simplecast.com. I can post some links or maybe we can share them out afterwards. And so what they basically do is just like give you a place to put your media files and then create the RSS feed that you need to be in Apple and Spotify. You won't magically, just like any other growth channel, you won't magically get more users. But the thing that is interesting about podcasting compared to other media is that the average time that people spend with it is much greater. So we've seen B2B companies do hour-long podcasts once a week or once every other week, where the average listener is actually spending the entire hour with them, which is very different than the average engagement on our blog is like 6 seconds or something, right? So it's like the idea that the average engagement is that big is pretty special. So you're reaching a smaller number of people potentially, but for a deeper level of engagement. That's what we think is super powerful.
Okay, great. And before closing up this session, do you have any more advices to startups, maybe helping them to survive this Corona days also, this outbreak, and how do you sustain your growth?
With regard to the Corona thing in particular, it's probably the advice you get from anybody else, which is just to be really conservative with cash. Cash is king, right? And it only flows basically one way unless you unless you figure out how to make money real fast. So we've been our business is tied to advertising. Advertising has taken a huge hit around the world, but we've been able to grow revenue despite that, and so we're really optimistic about our business. And that's because the service we provide to advertisers is helping them measure which ads are actually working. And when the world is so uncertain, attribution, like figuring out what's working, actually becomes more valuable, we think. So we've been able to sell more, which I feel very thankful for, and also our team has been working really hard on. With regard to kind of the general advice, I think for me, the thing that was hardest to internalize was just how long everything takes. This is my third company. It's actually the one I've worked on for the longest, and it's still only 2.5 years, almost 3 years, right? And all these things take at least 10 years, if not more. That's like, we hear about so many overnight successes and folks that they build something and it goes viral and they get acquired so quickly. That is not the case most of the time. I mean, good luck to you if you get that lucky. That's fantastic. But I think preparing yourself for a 10-year, 15-year journey, for me, it's made it a lot easier to kind of like, in some ways, it's taking the pressure off, right? Because like, I don't need to have the rocket ship take off tomorrow. We're just like slowly and steadily building. It's like, if I can get 10% growth every month, that adds up to like a lot. That's amazing. That's going to be an incredible outcome for our company. But it's not like the rocket ship took off and we get bought for $1 bazillion tomorrow. But hopefully that'll happen in 10 years, right?
Yeah, 10 years is not bad either.
Yeah, 10 years sounds pretty good, right? So I'm like, if I'm gonna have 10, I've only got 8 years to go. That's fine.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dave. It's been a pleasure to meet you and to listen to you, actually. I'm sure all the startups will benefit from this session. And we hope to see you back in Istanbul, hopefully.
I hope so too.
If you can, of course, organize Startup Istanbul on 20 to 22nd of October when this outbreak, this pandemic ends. So thank you again for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
And healthy.
Thank you. And thanks everyone for spending your time with me today. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
You're welcome. Have a nice day, all of you guys.